The banging came in threes. Three desperate strikes against a door made of rough pine planks, each one weaker than the last, each one swallowed a little more by the shrieking wind. Inside, the girl sat perfectly still. Firelight moved across her face, painting her sharp cheekbones in orange and shadow. A bowl of thin stew rested in her hands, steam curling upward and vanishing into the dark air above. She was 18 years old. She was completely alone, and someone was dying on her doorstep. She set the bowl down on the stone ledge beside the fire. Her fingers found the iron poker leaning against the chimney wall, and she wrapped them around its cold shaft, feeling the familiar weight settle into her grip. She did not move toward the door. Not yet. Her eyes traveled instead to the shelf on the far wall, where her food stores sat in careful measured rows. Flour nearly gone, a block of salt half its original size, a small clay jar of dried beans. Everything counted, everything rationed, every mouthful accounted for through the end of winter. The banging came again. Two strikes this time, then a muffled cry that was barely human, more animal than voice, the sound of a throat too frozen to form words. She looked down at the thin silver chain around her neck. She touched it once briefly with her free hand. Then she stood. But we are not there yet. That moment, that door, that impossible decision, all of it was still 3 months away, waiting at the end of a road she had not yet walked. To understand why she hesitated, why she held the poker instead of the latch, you have to go back to the beginning. Back to the day the first door closed. 3 months earlier, the latch clicked shut with a sound no thicker than a pin dropping, yet it carried the weight of a slammed vault. Ellie Whitmore stood on the porch of the only home she had ever known, and the silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Late September in the high country of Montana. The air already thin and sharp, carrying in it the faint metallic taste of the frost that would come the hard months ahead, the killing cold that would settle over the land like a judgment. Behind her through the door, she could hear her father's chair creak as he shifted his weight. Henry Whitmore had not walked her to the door. He had not touched her shoulder or spoken her name with any tenderness. He had sat at the kitchen table, his broad, weathered hands flat on the wood surface, and he had said the words he had clearly rehearsed, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on the far wall. A woman grown makes her own way. That was all. Not a farewell, not a blessing, an equation. One less mouth to feed was a measurable gain in a year when the crops had withered in the field and the last cow had been sold for less than half its worth. She did not hate him for it. That was the strange thing. She understood the arithmetic too well to waste energy on hatred. Love and hunger occupied different ledgers in a place like this, and when the numbers turned against you, sentiment was the first thing cut. The screen door banged open behind her. She turned. Thomas, her brother, 14 years old and small for his age, stood in the doorway with red eyes and clenched fists. He was holding something. He glanced back over his shoulder into the dark interior of the house, then stepped quickly onto the porch and pressed two objects into her hands. A box of matches half full, and a chain, a thin silver chain with a small oval pendant tarnished nearly black. Their mother's necklace, the only thing of hers that remained in the house. Ellie stared at it. "I can't take this. You need it more." Thomas shook his head, his jaw set in a way that made him look, for just a moment, much older than 14. "You don't have anything, Ellie. I still have a house." He said it without self-pity, just the plain truth stated plainly, and it struck her harder than anything their father had said. She closed her fingers around the chain and the matchbox, and she pulled her brother into a brief, fierce embrace, feeling his thin shoulders tremble once before he pulled away. She did not look back. She told herself it was strength, but the truth was simpler. If she looked back and saw his face in the window, she would not be able to leave, and she could not afford that. The walk into Silver Creek took 2 hours. The road was rutted from wagon wheels and dried into hard ridges by the autumn sun. She carried everything she owned. One second-hand coat, 2 cotton dresses rolled tight in a canvas bundle, a small knife, a tinder box, her mother's chain around her neck, and in her left hand a leather pouch containing $17. In her right a folded document so old and brittle that the creases had nearly worn through. A deed. The only other thing her father had given her, pulled from a tin box that held her grandmother's sparse effects. A piece of paper for a piece of land nobody wanted. Silver Creek was not much of a town. A single unpaved street lined with a dozen wooden buildings, most of them showing their age in warped planks and peeling paint. A livery stable, a boarding house, a small church with a crooked steeple, and at the center of it all, the general store Crawford's Mercantile, the only establishment that mattered when you needed supplies. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside. The smell hit her first, a thick, comforting blanket of cured meats, dry goods, coffee beans, and the faint, oily scent of new tools. Harlan Crawford stood behind his counter, a man of 55 with spectacles perched on the end of his nose and a pencil permanently tucked behind his ear. He was a decent man, cautious by nature, the kind who weighed every word on the same scale he used for flour. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted through recognition, sympathy, and something close to dread, all in the space of a breath. "Miss Whitmore," he said carefully, "heard about your situation. I'm sorry." Ellie placed the deed on the counter without ceremony. "I need to know what this is worth." Crawford picked it up, adjusted his spectacles, and read it slowly. His thumb rubbed the faded ink. She watched his face and saw the answer before he spoke. "The Hollow Rock claim," he sighed, setting the paper down as though it might crumble. "Your grandmother's old parcel. All rock and ravine, not a drop of reliable water to speak of. Only thing it's ever been good for is giving rattlesnakes a place to hide from the sun." He looked at her with genuine concern. $17 will buy you a stagecoach ticket east, maybe with a few meals to spare. That's the sensible play. The front door opened behind her. A current of cold air swept through the store, and with it came a man who seemed to fill the entire room simply by entering it. Leland Foss was 58 years old, built like an oak post, with a voice that had been trained by decades of shouting orders across open rangeland. He owned the largest ranch in the valley, a sprawling operation that employed most of the working men in the county. When Fossey spoke, Silver Creek listened, not because they loved him, but because they depended on him. He heard the name Hollow Rock and stopped. His eyes moved from Crawford to Ellie, appraising her the way a man appraises livestock at auction. "That old patch of nothing," Fossey said, his tone wrapped in false warmth. "Listen, young lady, I've been meaning to expand my grazing routes through that section. Tell you what, I'll take it off your hands for $5. Save you the headache of a tax burden on worthless dirt." $5. For land a grown man was actively trying to buy. Ellie's mind caught on that detail the way a nail catches fabric. If the land was truly worthless, why was the richest man in the county standing here offering money for it? She looked at Fossey, and something in his eyes, a flicker of calculation, quickly masked, told her everything she needed to know. He wanted her to say yes quickly before she had time to think. "No thank you, Mr. Fossey," she said. "I believe I'll hold on to it." The warmth dropped from his face like a curtain falling. It was there and gone in half a second, replaced by a broad smile that did not reach his eyes. He clapped Crawford on the shoulder, said something pleasant about the weather, and walked out. The bell jingled cheerfully behind him, utterly indifferent to what had just transpired. Crawford watched him go, then turned back to Ellie with a look she would come to understand later, the look of a man who wanted to warn her but was afraid of the pain. She turned to the shelves. "I'll need a good axe," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "A bow saw, 50 pounds of flour, a block of salt, and as many dried beans as the rest will buy." Crawford stared at her. "That'll leave you with next to nothing." "I'm already there," Ellie replied, pushing the coins across the worn wood. He packed her supply in silence. The axe was last, and he placed it on the counter with a kind of finality, as though he were handing her a headstone instead of a tool. She was hoisting the heavy sack onto her back when the front door opened once more. A man she had never seen stepped inside, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who had learned long ago that speed was a waste of energy. Walt Harden was 65, with hands the size of dinner plates and a face so deeply lined it looked carved from the same granite that gave the mountains their shape. He was the town blacksmith, or had been before age, and Foss's decision to take his business elsewhere had reduced him to occasional work and quiet stubbornness. Walt said nothing to Ellie inside the store. He conducted his own business, with Crawford placing a bundle of hand-forged nails on the counter and collecting payment. But outside on the porch, as Ellie struggled to balance the flour sack and the axe, he spoke. "That axe," he said, nodding at it. "The handle's ash, cheap ash. You swing it hard every day, it'll crack before the third week." He paused. "Bring it by my shop. I'll put an oak handle on it. No charge." Ellie looked at him, searching his face for pity or ulterior motive. She found neither. Just the plain offer of a man who knew tools and couldn't abide seeing a bad one sent out into the world. "Why?" she asked. Walt glanced back through the store window where Crawford was straightening his shelves and carefully not looking at either of them. Because I've seen what happens when someone goes up against that country with the wrong equipment, he said. Then he walked away, his boot heels grinding on the dry planks of the boardwalk. She was leaving the blacksmith's shop an hour later, the axe now fitted with a handle of dense white oak that felt alive in her grip when a figure stepped into her path. Ruth Aiken was 62, a widow who had lived alone for 8 years on a hardscrabble homestead 3 miles from the Hollow Rock claim. Her face was a map of losses, each line etched by wind grief and the slow erosion of hope. She blocked the boardwalk with her body and spoke without preamble. "That land borders mine," Ruth said, her voice carrying the edge of something held back for a long time. "Your grandmother promised to sell it to me. Year of 51. The drought. I lent her 30 pounds of flour to get through the winter, and she swore she'd sign that parcel over to me as payment. Then she died before the ink was dry. You have no right to be on it." Ellie met the woman's stare without flinching. "I have a deed," she said, "legally filed." "Paper isn't justice," Ruth shot back. She held Ellie's gaze for a long, charged moment, then stepped aside, her expression making clear that this conversation was only postponed, not finished. 3 encounters in a single morning. 3 forces that would shape everything to come. A powerful man who wanted her land, a bitter woman who believed she was owed it, and a quiet old blacksmith who, for reasons Ellie did not yet understand, had given her the only fair deal she had received all day. She walked out of Silver Creek with the flour sack grinding into her shoulders and the oak-handled axe resting solid in her grip. Behind her, the town shrank to a smudge of gray wood and thin chimney smoke. Ahead, the land rose toward the high country, toward rock and ravine, toward a place no one believed could sustain life. The journey took 2 days. By the end of the first hour, the wagon road faded to a footpath. By the end of the first day, the footpath vanished entirely, and she was navigating by the shape of the ridgeline against the sky. The fertile bottomland soil gave way to fractured stone and thorny scrub that tore at the hem of her dress with every step. She saw no other person, no cabin, no smoke, only a few resilient lizards and a single hawk riding the thermals high above a lonely sentinel in the vast and empty blue. That first night she made camp in the lee of a boulder, building a small fire and eating a thin gruel of flour and water. She was almost asleep when she heard them. Wolves, not the distant, romantic howling of storybooks, but the close conversational yipping of a pack that had caught her scent and was circling to investigate. She saw their eyes first, 3 pairs of amber lights floating in the darkness just beyond the firelight's reach. She did not run. She did not scream. She stood up, gripped a burning branch from the fire, and took 1 step toward them. Just one. A declaration. The eyes held steady for a moment, then drifted backward into the black. She did not sleep. She sat with her back against the boulder and the knife in her hand, feeding the fire until dawn painted the sky in shades of cold pink and gray. Then she stood, shouldered her burden, and walked on. By late afternoon of the second day, she found it. The cliff face rose from the earth like a wall built by a hand far older and more patient than any human architect. Gray granite, weathered by millennia of wind and ice, seamed with cracks and streaked with the dark stains of ancient water. And at its base, a dark opening, a mouth in the rock, roughly 10 feet wide and 8 feet tall, leading into blackness. This was her land, her inheritance, her future. The despair that hit her was so sudden and so complete that it nearly buckled her knees. She stood there, the flour sack pulling her shoulders toward the ground, and stared at the cave, and she understood with terrible clarity why Crawford had pitied her, why Fosse had offered $5 with such confidence, why Ruth Aiken looked at her like she was already dead. It was a hole in the earth, a shelter for snakes and shadows, and nothing more. The wind picked up as the sun began its descent, slicing through her coat. There was no other shelter within miles, no stand of trees to block the coming cold. She had no choice. She unslung her supplies and approached the entrance. The air coming from within the cave was different. Not warm, but still, absent of wind. She struck a match from Thomas's box, lit a twist of dried grass, and stepped inside. The entrance tunnel was short, perhaps 15 feet, before it opened into something she did not expect. A vaulted chamber, high-ceilinged and broad, its walls smooth and rounded by thousands of years of water that no longer flowed. The floor was a mix of dry sand and fine gravel. She walked deeper, her small flame pushing against the immense dark, and as she moved, she felt the air change around her. The temperature stabilized, cool but not cold, perfectly still. A deep, consistent environment sealed away from everything happening on the surface. Then she heard it. A sound so faint she thought at first she was imagining it. A slow, rhythmic drip. She followed the echo to a narrow fissure in the far wall, and there emerging from a crack in the stone, a single drop of water caught her light, shimmered for an instant, and fell with a clear, resonant plink into a shallow basin carved into the rock below. The pool was small, perhaps the size of a dinner plate, but the water was clean cold and utterly clear. She pressed her palm flat against the cave wall. The stone was cool to the touch, but beneath that coolness was something deeper. A vast stored warmth, the thermal memory of summer sunlight absorbed by thousands of tons of rock. This mass would resist the winter cold the way a ship's hull resists the sea, slowly, massively, inevitably. When the world outside dropped to 30 below zero, this chamber would hold at something close to 50 degrees. Not warm by any human standard, but a universe away from death. She stood in the darkness, her small fire crackling her hand on the living stone, and she felt the despair drain out of her like water from a cracked vessel. The town saw a useless hole. They were wrong. This cave was a well, a root cellar, a fortress against the killing frost. The town had looked at this land and seen an ending. She was looking at the same land and seeing a beginning. The first week nearly broke her. Every morning she woke with her muscles screaming, her palms raw with burst blisters that reopened with each grip of the axe handle. But every morning she rose and faced the work because the alternative to working was dying, and she had decided somewhere between the closing of her father's door and the first strike of the axe that she was not going to die. Her plan was simple in concept and monumental in execution. The cave would be the protected core of her homestead. The living space would be a cabin built against the cliff face, sealing the cave entrance and creating a two-chambered shelter. Cabin in front for warmth and light. Cave behind for storage, livestock, and growing. She found a small grove of hardy pine a quarter-mile down the ravine and began felling trees. She had never done this before, but her father, for all his coldness, had been a man who believed in watching a thing done right. She remembered the way he sized up a trunk, the angle of the notch that guided the fall. Her first attempts were clumsy. The saw caught and stuck. Her axe strokes landed flat and bounced. But she was methodical. She adjusted. She learned the rhythm. And when the first tree groaned, cracked, and crashed to earth, the sound was both terrifying and deeply viscerally satisfying. It was proof, the first tangible piece of her new world lying at her feet. Getting the logs to the building site was its own brutal education. She could not lift them, so she learned leverage. Smaller branches became rollers. The natural slope of the ravine became her ally. She cleared pathways through the brush and used gravity wherever the land allowed. Each log took a full day of sweat and strain. On the fifth day, the rope snapped. She was hauling the largest log, yet a thick pine trunk that would form the center beam of her front wall when the line parted with a sound like a gunshot. The log rolled backward, gathering speed on the slope. She threw herself sideways, and it missed her by inches, but her left ankle twisted under her as she fell, and a bolt of white pain shot up her leg. She lay in the dirt, the breath knocked out of her, and felt the ankle begin to swell immediately. She crawled back to the cave. That night she lay in the darkness, with her ankle propped on a stone, a strip of wet cloth wrapped around the swelling, and she allowed herself to cry. Not from the pain, from the loneliness. No one knew she was here. If she died, no one would come looking. Thomas would wait for a letter that would never arrive, and eventually stop waiting, and her name would become one of those small, sad stories people told to illustrate the foolishness of pride. She pressed the silver chain against her lips and felt the metal warm against her skin. Thomas had given it to her because he believed she would need it. Not the silver, not the pendant, the reminder that somewhere someone knew she existed, that her life was not untethered. In the morning, she wrapped the ankle with strips torn from the hem of her second dress, tightened the binding until the joint was rigid, and stood up. Every step sent a spike of pain through her leg. She picked up the axe and went back to work. By the end of the week, 12 stripped logs lay near the cave mouth. The stone foundation was set flat, heavy rocks levered into place to form a rectangle 12 paces long and 8 paces wide. Small, but solid. Hers. It was the afternoon of the 8th day when she heard the horse. She had the axe in her hand before she was fully upright, her body already conditioned to treat any unexpected sound as a potential threat. A young man on a bay gelding came around the bend of the ravine and pulled up short when he saw her. Jed Parrish was 22, lean and sun-darkened, with the look of a man who spent his days in the saddle and his nights in a bunkhouse. He worked cattle for Fosse's ranch, and that fact alone was enough to put Ellie on edge. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "I'm not supposed to be here," he said, cutting straight to the point. "Fosse told every man on the ranch to stay clear of this section. But you need to know something, and nobody else is going to tell you." Ellie kept the axe at her side ready. "I'm listening," Jed told her. Fosse did not want hollow rock for grazing. He wanted the water. An underground seam, a vein of groundwater that ran beneath the ridge and surfaced through fissures in the rock. In a dry year, and there had been 3 dry years running, whoever controlled that water controlled the entire valley. Fosse had hired a survey engineer 2 years ago and knew exactly what lay beneath this parcel. He had been waiting for Ellie's grandmother to die so he could buy the land from the family for nothing. "He won't let you stay," Jed said. "He's not the kind of man who takes no for an answer." "Why are you telling me this?" Jed was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, stripped of the casual confidence he had walked in with. "My mother had a small homestead on the east side of the valley, Ada Parish. 5 years ago, when she got sick, Fosse came to her with an offer, a fraction of what the land was worth. She was too weak to fight him, too sick to go to the courthouse, too alone to hire a lawyer. She signed because she had no choice. She died a year later, and I've been working for the man who took everything she had because there's nowhere else to go." He paused. "I see my mother in what's happening to you. That's why." Before he left, he set a coil of new rope and a small rabbit snare on a rock near the cave entrance. "Don't tell anyone I was here," he said, and then he was gone, the bay gelding carrying him back down the ravine and out of sight. Ellie stood holding the rope, feeling its rough, honest weight in her hands, and something shifted inside her. She was not entirely alone. Not everyone in this valley had surrendered to Fosse's gravity. There were those who resisted quietly at great personal risk in ways that would never be seen or celebrated. 2 mornings later, she found the damage. The rabbit snare had been cut cleanly with a blade, the wire pieces scattered in the dirt. Not an animal, a person. Nearby hoof prints pressed deep into the soft ground, the kind made by shod horses, ranch horses. And when she followed the prints down the ravine to the pine grove, she saw it. Every tree in the grove had been marked with a slash of red paint. Timber rights. Someone had filed a claim on the cutting rights to this section of forest. Fosse. The implication was surgical in its precision. No timber meant no cabin. No cabin meant no surviving winter. Fosse did not need to take her land. He just needed to make sure she could not live on it. She stood in the grove, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached, her hands trembling with a fury she had no outlet for. The helplessness of it was suffocating. He had money, he had men, he had lawyers and ledgers and 30 years of accumulated power. She had an axe and 17 cents left to her name. Then she looked up. Above the grove, the cliff face rose in a sheer wall of fractured granite. Broken stone lay scattered at its base in slabs and chunks of every size, an inexhaustible supply of building material that no one could claim, no one could mark, no one could take from her, because it was her land, and the rock was part of it. She picked up the first stone. It was heavy, perhaps 40 pounds, roughly flat on 2 sides. She carried it to the building site and set it in the gap where the next log should have gone. Then she went back for another. And another. Fosse had cut off her timber. So she would build with stone. It would take longer. It would be harder. But stone did not burn, did not rot, and could not be taken away by a man with a pot of red paint and a forged document. The walls went up with agonizing slowness. Log and stone, together the gaps chinked with mud, mixed from sandy soil water and dry grass. She built a fireplace into the cliff face itself, of stacking flat stones with mud mortar, fashioning a flue that vented through a natural crack in the rock overhead. The first fire filled the cabin with smoke, and for a terrible moment she thought she had failed. But she found the blockage, cleared it, and tried again. This time the smoke drew upward, a thin gray thread disappearing into stone, and a steady warmth began to fill the small space. She sat before the flames, the heat soaking into her aching bones, and felt something she had not felt since the day the door closed behind her. Not happiness. Something older and more durable. The knowledge that she had built something real, something that would stand with nothing but her own labor and the materials the earth provided. Now the cave. She hauled buckets of rich, dark soil from a sheltered pocket of the ravine, creating raised beds in the front section where ambient light reached. She planted the few seeds she had managed to afford. Carrot seeds, a handful of hardy winter lettuce, a desperate gamble in subterranean agriculture. The rest of the cave she sectioned off with low fences woven from green saplings, creating pens for the livestock she did not yet own, but would need if she was going to survive. The flour was running out, the beans were down to a final handful, and the first snow had begun to dust the high peaks with white. Winter was closing in, and Ellie knew she had to return to Silver Creek one more time. She needed animals, she needed salt. She needed to walk back into the town that had written her off and spend her last coins on a future that every person there believed was already dead. She looked at her hands before she left. They were not the same hands that had pushed $17 across Crawford's counter. The blisters had hardened into calluses. The nails were broken short. A deep cut across her right palm earned from a slipped chisel had healed into a raised white scar. These were not the hands of a girl. They were the hands of someone who had argued with the land and refused to lose. She fastened the silver chain securely around her neck, tucked it beneath her collar, and began the long walk back toward town. The axe rode on her shoulder, its oak handle smooth and dark with use. Behind her, the cabin waited, its stone and timber walls solid against the cliff. Inside the cave, the water dripped its patient rhythm into the stone basin, counting the seconds until her return. She knew what was waiting for her in Silver Creek. Crawford's cautious sympathy, the stares, the whispers. But more than that, she knew Fosse would be there. And by now he would know that she was still alive, still on the land, still refusing to break. The red paint on the trees had been his opening move. She had answered it with stone. The next move was his. Silver Creek smelled different when you walked into it the second time. Or maybe it was Ellie who had changed and the town simply reflected her new understanding of it back at her. The same unpaved street, the same warped storefronts. But the distances between buildings seemed smaller now, the whole settlement compressed and fragile, as though a strong wind could scatter it like a handful of dry leaves. She had spent weeks in a landscape so vast and indifferent that this cluster of wooden structures felt almost quaint, a child's model of civilization set down in the middle of something ancient and uncaring. The bell above Crawford's door announced her. Harlan Crawford looked up from his ledger, and this time his face did not cycle through sympathy and dread. It registered surprise, quickly controlled, followed by something she had not seen there before. Reassessment. He took in her leaner frame, the sun-darkened skin, the way she stood with her weight balanced, and her shoulders set, the hands that rested at her sides like instruments that had been tested and proven. "Well," he said, leaning against the counter, "you made it." Silas Munn was folded into a chair near the potbelly stove, his legs stretched out, a wad of tobacco bulging in his cheek. He was somewhere around 40 with the kind of permanent squint that comes from decades of reading animal tracks in bright snow. He turned his head to look at Ellie the way a man looks at a stray dog that keeps showing up on his porch. "Winter's about to come down hard," Silas said, sending a brown stream of juice into the spittoon at his feet. "That hole in the rock is going to be your coffin when the real cold hits." Ellie ignored him. She walked to the counter and placed her remaining bills and coins in a small, neat stack. "4 laying hens," she said, "a pair of sheep, a ewe and a ram, and 50 pounds of salt." Crawford let out a low whistle. "That'll clean you out. Every last cent. And the animals will freeze before New Year's." "That's my concern, Mr. Crawford." He counted the money, counted it again. Then he began filling the order in silence, his lips pressed together in a thin line, the pencil behind his ear bobbing as he moved. Silas watched from his chair, shaking his head slowly, the way people shake their heads at funerals. The front door opened. The bell jingled, and the temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees before the outside cold even reached them. Fosse stepped in, flanked by 2 ranch hands she did not recognize. Not Jed. These were older men with closed faces and the easy confidence of those who always stood on the winning side. Fosse did not acknowledge Ellie directly. He addressed Crawford instead, his voice filling the store with the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Harlan, we need to discuss the ranch's winter supply order. My office, tomorrow morning." Then, almost as an afterthought, he turned to Ellie. "Miss Whitmore, I hear you're still up there on the rock." He paused, adjusting his gloves with deliberate care. "You should know I've been reviewing the access routes to that section. The road up to Hollow Rock crosses my property line in 2 places. I'm considering closing those crossings. Liability, you understand. Can't have stray livestock wandering onto my grazing land. The store went quiet. Crawford's pencil stopped moving. Even Silas sat up straighter, sensing the shift. Everyone in the room understood what Fosse was saying. If those crossings closed, Ellie was cut off. No way in or out for supplies, livestock, or herself. That road is a public right-of-way, Mr. Fosse, Ellie said. Her voice did not waver. Filed with the county in 1847. Fosse smiled, the kind of smile that is really a warning. County records are a matter for lawyers. Do you have a lawyer, Miss Whitmore? The silence stretched. Crawford studied his counter as though it contained the answer to a question no one had asked. He was afraid. Ellie could see it in the way he gripped the edge of the wood knuckles white. Fosse's winter supply order was the single largest account the store carried. Without it, Crawford's business would barely survive to spring. Then the door opened a third time. Walt Harden walked in unhurried, carrying a bundle of iron nails he had forged for Crawford's regular order. He set them on the counter, collected his payment, and turned to leave. But halfway to the door, he stopped. The Hollow Rock Road is public access, Walt said, not looking at Fosse, not looking at anyone in particular, addressing the room as though he were commenting on the weather. Has been since 1847. My father helped the county board build it. The survey record is in the town hall, third cabinet from the left bottom drawer. He paused, letting the precision of that detail settle over the room. If anyone tried to close it, the county board would have to be involved. Public record, public hearing, lots of questions asked in the open. He walked out without waiting for a response. He had not raised his voice. He had not challenged Fosse directly. He had simply placed a fact on the table and left it there solid and immovable, the way a blacksmith sets an anvil. Fosse said nothing. His jaw worked once, twice, the muscles flexing beneath the skin. Then he turned and walked out, his two ranch hands falling in behind him. The bell jingled and the store exhaled. Crawford finished filling Ellie's order without another word. When she left, guiding the reluctant sheep on a rope lead and carrying the crate of clucking hens under her free arm, the people of Silver Creek lined the boardwalk and watched her go. She heard the whispers. Poor thing. Lost her mind to grief. She felt their judgment settle on her shoulders, a weight as real and as familiar as the flour sack she had carried weeks before. But she kept walking, and the whispers faded behind her, with the town growing smaller and quieter until they were nothing at all. On the outskirts, passing the Foss Ranch corrals, she spotted Jed from the corner of her eye. He was bent over a saddle on a fence rail, working the leather with an awl, his hat pulled low. He did not look up. But leaning against the fence post, positioned with the careful casualness of something left behind by accident, was a tight bundle of dried hay, enough to feed the sheep for 2 days on the trail. Ellie picked it up without slowing her step and kept moving. The journey back was the longest walk of her life. The sheep protested every incline. The chickens clucked in outrage at every jolt. She coaxed, dragged, carried, and cursed under her breath for 2 solid days. But when she finally led the animals through the heavy plank door of her cabin and into the waiting stillness of the cave beyond, something happened that she had not anticipated. The sheep, sensing shelter from the wind, stopped struggling immediately. They stood in the dim space, their breath misting gently in the lantern light, and began to nose the dry ground. The chickens pecked at the gravel with sudden businesslike interest. The animals knew on some level deeper than thought that this was a safe place. Ellie closed the cabin door, leaned her back against it, and allowed herself 10 seconds of stillness. Her small world was complete. Cabin, cave, fire, water, soil, seeds, animals. Each piece placed deliberately like stones in a wall, each one supporting the others. 2 weeks passed. The system settled into rhythm. She fed the animals, tended the tiny garden plots where pale shoots were beginning to push through the cave soil, and rationed her food with the precision of a mathematician. Then one morning she drew water from the basin and noticed something wrong. The water had a smell, faint, almost undetectable but present, a sourness that did not belong. She cupped a handful and brought it to her lips but did not drink. She touched the tip of her tongue to the surface. Bitter, a trace of something chemical, something that should not exist in water filtering through 1,000 feet of natural stone. She set the cup down, her mind racing. Then she climbed outside, working her way up the cliff face to the spot where she knew the water entered the rock from above. It took her an hour of careful searching before she found it. A crack in the stone near the ridgeline, one of several natural fissures that channeled rainwater down into the underground seam. And packed into this crack, wedged deliberately into the stone, was a mixture of ash and a fine gray powder she did not recognize. Someone had climbed up here in the dark, found the fissure, and poisoned it. Not enough to kill a person outright, just enough to sicken livestock, just enough to make the water unusable, just enough to force her out. She knelt on the cold stone and stared at the contaminated fissure, and for a full minute she did not move. The anger that rose in her was unlike anything she had experienced before. It was not the hot, explosive fury of injustice. It was cold architectural, a rage that organized itself into compartments and demanded action, rather than outcry. She cleaned the fissure. She filtered the water through layers of sand and charcoal packed into a cloth sack, the way she had once read about in an old almanac she had found in her father's house years ago. She sealed every accessible crack on the upper ridge with mud and stone, leaving only the deepest natural channels that no person could reach from the surface. Then she did something she had never done before. She walked to Ruth Aiken's cabin. Ruth opened the door with a face as welcoming as a closed fist. She stood in the doorway, blocking it with her body, her arms crossed, and waited. "Someone poisoned my water source," Ellie said without greeting, without preamble. "I'm not here to accuse you. I know it wasn't you, but your homestead is the closest property to mine, and if anyone passed through at night, you might have seen or heard them." Ruth studied her. The older woman's eyes moved over Ellie's face, reading it the way a tracker reads the ground, looking for deception, for weakness, for the kind of calculation that comes before a lie. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because after a long silence, her arms uncrossed. "2 nights ago," Ruth said, "2 riders crossing my south pasture before dawn. Moving quiet, no lanterns. I know those horses. They're Fosse stock. I've watched them graze along my fence line for 15 years. Ellie nodded. She had expected this, but hearing it confirmed still landed like a blow. Ruth was not finished. Her voice changed, the sharp edge softening into something raw, less defended. "I have my quarrel with you over that land. You know that. And I won't pretend I don't think your grandmother owed me. But I am not the kind of woman who poisons a well. And Fosse is." She paused. "There are things I will do and things I won't. I draw a line, and the line is where the animals start to suffer. Fosse doesn't have that line." Ellie turned to leave. She was 3 steps from the porch when Ruth spoke again, her voice barely above a murmur. "My west fence line, about a quarter-mile south of the old lightning oak. There's a gap. Been meaning to fix it, but my back won't let me anymore. If a person needed a different way up to the ridge, a way that doesn't cross Fosse property, she could walk right through that gap and no one would see her go." Ellie stopped. She turned and looked at Ruth, and for a moment the 2 women regarded each other across a silence that held the weight of debts, unpaid promises broken, and the grudging recognition that they were, despite everything, cut from the same unyielding cloth. "Thank you, Mrs. Aiken," Ellie said. "Don't thank me," Ruth replied, already turning back inside. "I didn't do anything. I just have a broken fence." The deep winter settled in like an occupying army. The sky became a permanent low ceiling of iron gray, and the sun, when it appeared at all, was a pale, distant coin that gave light without warmth. Ellie's days contracted into a strict choreography of survival. Fire first, ways fire first. Stoking the embers in the dark, feeding them dried pine until the flames steadied and the cabin began to shed its nightly accumulation of cold. Then the cave. The animals, water from the basin, hay for the sheep, feed for the chickens, and the small recurring miracle of the eggs, each one a perfect self-contained gift from the contained world she had built. She tended the garden with the care of a surgeon. The lettuce was pale, the carrots were thin, but they were growing. Underground in darkness, in defiance of everything the season demanded. She watered them with careful, measured portions, her fingers sinking into the cool soil, feeling for root structure, for growth, for life. Her meals were enough. Thin bean stew, salted mutton from one of the older animals she had been forced to slaughter, the occasional carrot, the occasional egg. She was losing weight, but slowly, and her body was adapting, converting fuel into work with increasing efficiency. The afternoons were spent mending, sharpening, weaving the essential maintenance that held entropy at bay. She spoke only to the animals, soft, low words that sounded strange and foreign in the immense silence. She was utterly alone. But the loneliness did not hollow her out the way she had feared it would. The work filled every space, every moment, leaving no room for the kind of self-pity that feeds on idleness. Then one night, the ewe stopped eating. Ellie found her lying on her side in the pen, breathing in short, labored gasps, her eyes glassy and unfocused. The animal's belly was distended tight as a drum. Ellie knelt beside her, her hands moving over the rough wool, feeling the heat radiating from the skin beneath. She did not know what was wrong. She had no book, no veterinary knowledge, no neighbor to call for advice. She knew only that this sheep was the center of her plan. Without her, there would be no lamb in spring. Without a lamb, the flock could not grow. Without a growing flock, the entire architecture of her survival began to crumble. She stayed beside the ewe all night. She heated water from the basin and soaked rags to lay across the animal's swollen belly. She mixed a thin gruel of flour and salt and tried to coax the sheep to drink. The hours passed with agonizing slowness, marked only by the metronome of dripping water and the occasional low moan from the suffering animal. Sometime past midnight, in the deepest trough of the dark, Ellie sat with her back against the cave wall and her hand resting on the ewe's flank, feeling the shallow rise and fall of each breath, and she spoke aloud. "I don't know what I'm doing." Her own voice startled her, too loud in the enclosed space, too honest. "I don't know anything about any of this. I'm an 18-year-old girl sitting in a cave talking to a sheep." She laughed then, a dry, cracked sound that could easily have been a sob. It bounced off the stone walls and came back to her, multiplied an echo of her own exhaustion. This was the closest she had come to surrender. Not during the ankle injury, not when she saw the red paint on the trees, not when she found the poison in her water. Here in the dark with a dying animal and no one to turn to, the full weight of what she had attempted settled on her chest like a stone slab. She was one girl, alone, against a winter that did not care about her courage or her plans. She closed her eyes and pressed the silver chain against her throat. Thomas. She thought about Thomas. What he was doing right now at this exact moment in the house she had left behind. Was he warm? Was he fed? Was he lying in his narrow bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if his sister was alive or dead? She had given him no way to find out. No address, no letter. She had walked away from the only person who loved her and had given him nothing in return except silence. The guilt was sudden and total, a wave that crashed over her and left her gasping. But it also clarified something. If she died here, Thomas would never know. He would spend the rest of his life wondering. And that, more than any amount of willpower or stubbornness, was unacceptable. She could not die because dying would be a cruelty inflicted on her brother. She opened her eyes. The ewe's breathing had changed, slower, deeper. The frantic quality was gone. Ellie placed her palm flat on the animal's belly and felt the tension easing, the distension softening. By dawn, the sheep raised its head. By mid-morning, it was standing shaky but upright, nosing at the hay rack. By afternoon, it was eating. Ellie never knew what had been wrong. Colic, perhaps. Something she ate that disagreed. A simple thing, a common thing. The kind of minor crisis that a real farmer would have handled without losing a night's sleep. But for Ellie, sitting in the dark with her hand on a dying animal and nothing between her and despair, except a thin silver chain and the thought of her brother's face, it had been something else entirely. A test she had not known she was taking, administered by an examiner who graded on a single criterion. Are you willing to stay when staying makes no sense? She was. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, the cold more penetrating. She reinforced her routines, tightened her rationing, and waited. She did not know what she was waiting for, only that the land was building towards something. She could feel it the way animals feel a coming earthquake, a deep unease that had nothing to do with rational thought. It came on a Tuesday evening. A low hum rose from the rock itself, a vibration she felt in her teeth and her breastbone before she heard it with her ears. She pressed her palm against the cave wall and felt the stone trembling, not with force but with resonance, as though the entire cliff were a tuning fork, struck by something immense and far away. She walked to the cabin and looked out through the small glass window she had salvaged from a derelict wagon. The sky was the color of a bruise. The air had gone perfectly still, and in that stillness was a pressure so heavy it seemed to push down on the roof of the cabin. The first flakes were not flakes at all. They were hard pellets, tiny balls of ice that rattled against the window glass and skittered across the frozen ground. The wind followed, rising from nothing to a shriek in the space of an hour, a wall of moving air that hit the cabin broadside and made the timbers groan. She wedged the heavy log brace against the door and stepped back. Within 3 hours, the window was buried. The light inside the cabin reduced to the flickering orange of the fire and the dim glow of her single lantern. But the terrible, relentless roar of the wind was muffled now, the tons of snow piling against the walls, creating a second barrier, sealing her in. She moved to the cave. Here the storm did not exist. The air was still. The sheep chewed. The chickens slept. The water dripped. She sat down on the stone floor and placed her hand flat against the wall. Cool, unmoved, eternal. She was not fighting the storm. She was simply outside its reach. Then she heard it. A rhythmic anomaly in the symphony of wind. Not a natural sound, not the groan of a tree or the crack of a branch. It was a muffled, thudding 3 beats, then a pause, then 3 beats again, in a pattern too deliberate to be random. It was coming from the front door. Her hand found the iron poker before her mind finished processing what she was hearing. She moved to the cabin, the warmth of the fire on her face, the howl of the storm leaking through the sealed cracks in the doorframe. The banging came again, weaker, then a sound that stopped her heart. A human voice. Not words, just a cry ragged and barely audible above the gale. The sound of someone who had used up everything they had. Her first instinct was the one she had trained into herself over months of solitude. Threat assessment. Her eyes moved to the food shelf, to the woodpile, to the water bucket. Every resource in this cabin was measured, accounted for, calibrated to sustain one person through the winter. An intruder was not a guest. An intruder was a variable that could collapse the entire equation. And behind that calculation, another thought, darker and more honest. She knew who was out there. Not specifically, not by name, but by category. It was someone from the town. Someone from the world that had judged her, pitied her, dismissed her, called her a fool and a dead girl walking. Someone who had watched her leave Silver Creek with her sheep and her chickens and had shaken their head and whispered, "Poor thing, lost her mind." One of them was now on her doorstep begging for the shelter they had told her she would never have. A bitter, legitimate part of her wanted to let the storm take them. Let them discover what it felt like to be left outside. Let them learn the arithmetic of survival from the other side of the equation. They had called her home a tomb. Let their prophecy come true for them instead. The wind screamed. The banging faded to a feeble, scraping fingers against wood, the last effort of a body shutting down. Ellie looked down at the silver chain resting against her collarbone. Thomas's face floated up from somewhere deep in her memory. 14 years old, standing on the porch, pressing the chain and the matchbox into her hands. "I still have a house. You don't have anything." A child giving away the most precious thing he owned because he understood at 14 a truth that most adults never learn. You give not because the other person deserves it. You give because you can. She lifted the log brace and pulled the door open. The storm slammed into the cabin with physical force, a horizontal blast of snow and ice that stung her face and nearly knocked her backward. A figure fell through the opening and collapsed on the floor at her feet, more snow than human, a shapeless mound of white that did not move. She threw her weight against the door, driving it closed against the wind, and dropped the brace back into place. Then she knelt beside the figure and began brushing away the snow. The face that emerged was blue and cracked, the lips split, the eyes half open and unfocused. She recognized him. Silas Munn, the trapper who had sat by the stove in Crawford's store and told her the cave would be her coffin. She dragged him closer to the fire. His clothes were stiff with ice. His fingers, when she pried them open, were white and waxy. She wrapped him in her only spare blanket and held a cup of warm water to his lips. He drank in small, choking sips, his body shaking so violently that the cup rattled against his teeth. When he could speak, his voice was a ruin. "Wagon overturned," he gasped. "Crawford and his wife, half a mile back, maybe more, by the road, or where the road used to be." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Saw your chimney smoke through a break in the snow. Thought I was seeing a ghost. 3 people, not 1, 3. Ellie stood up. She looked at the fire. She looked at the food shelf. She looked at Silas, shivering beneath her blanket, already consuming warmth and resources that were not budgeted for his existence. Then she looked at the door and, beyond it, the storm that was now burying the world in white. She began pulling on every layer of clothing she owned. 2 dresses, one over the other, her mended coat, a wool scarf wrapped around her face until only her eyes showed. She took the lantern, the coil of rope Jed had given her, and the sealed pot of remaining stew still warm from the fire. She looked at Silas, who was watching her with an expression of dawning disbelief. "You can't," he whispered. "You'll die out there." She did not answer. She lifted the log brace, opened the door just wide enough to slip through, and stepped out into the howling white nothing. The wind tried to kill her in the first 30 seconds. It came from the north with a velocity that turned snowflakes into projectiles, each one stinging her exposed eyelids, the only part of her face the wool scarf did not cover. She could not see more than 2 feet in any direction. The world had been reduced to a roaring formless white, a void that erased distance, direction, and time. She kept her left hand on the cliff face. That was the rule she had given herself before stepping outside. Keep the stone, lose everything. The granite was slick with ice and crusted snow, but it was there, solid and knowable, the one fixed point in a universe that had lost all others. She moved along it step by step, each footfall sinking knee-deep into powder that concealed rocks, roots, and sudden drops. The lantern in her right hand was useless for seeing, but essential for being seen. If Crawford and his wife were alive and conscious, they would be looking for light. The sealed pot of stew was lashed to her back with the rope. She could feel its warmth against her spine, the last heat left in the world outside her cabin. She counted her steps. 20, 50, 100. The cliff face curved and she followed it, trusting the geography she had memorized during months of daily labor. The road, or what had been the road before the storm buried it, ran roughly parallel to the base of the ridge, a quarter-mile to the west. If Silas was right, the overturned wagon was somewhere along that stretch. At step 140, the cliff face ended. The stone simply stopped giving way to open ground, and Ellie's hand closed on nothing. She stood in the gap, the wind tearing at her from every side, and felt the first lurch of genuine panic. Without the cliff, she had no reference point. She could walk in circles until she collapsed. She could walk off the edge of the ravine. She could walk directly away from the wagon and never find it. She knelt down. The snow was 3 feet deep, here drifted against the base of the ridge. She dug with her bare hands, fingers burning, until she touched the hard frozen earth beneath. Then she felt sideways, looking for the texture change that would mark the old roadbed, the packed gravel surface that was different from the natural soil surrounding it. Her right hand found it, a strip of compacted ground running roughly northwest. She followed it on her hands and knees for the next 100 yards, crawling through snow that threatened to swallow her whole, her lantern held out ahead of her like an offering to the darkness. The cold was no longer an external force. It had moved inside her, settling into her joints, her fingers, the roots of her teeth. Her lungs burned with each breath, the air so frigid it felt like inhaling ground glass. Then she saw it, a dark shape barely distinguishable from the white chaos around it, roughly 30 yards ahead. The angular outline of a wagon lying on its side, one wheel still turning slowly in the wind, the canvas cover shredded and flapping. She crawled toward it, and as she rounded the upturned bed, her lantern light fell upon 2 figures huddled against the sheltered side of the wreck. Harlan Crawford had his arms wrapped around his wife. Dorothea was pressed against his chest, her face buried in his coat, her body still but shaking in small, involuntary tremors. Crawford looked up when the light hit his face. In the expression she saw, there was not one she had words for. It was the look of a man who had accepted death, made his peace with it, and was now being told that the terms had changed. "Miss Whitmore," he whispered. His voice was a husk, scraped raw by cold and disbelief. "How in God's name?" There was no time for conversation. She pressed the warm pot of stew into his hands and gestured for him to drink to feed Dorothea. While they fumbled with the lid, she unwound the rope from her shoulders and tied one end around Crawford's waist. She tied the other end around her own. If they got separated in the return journey, the rope would keep them connected. She could not carry them both, but she could lead them. Getting them to their feet was a battle. Crawford could stand, though he swayed and stumbled. Dorothea could barely support her own weight. Ellie positioned herself on Dorothea's left side, the older woman's arm draped across her shoulders, and they began to move. The return was a waking nightmare. Every step Ellie had taken outbound now had to be retraced, carrying a 120 pounds of half-frozen woman. Her legs shook, her lower back screamed. The rope between her and Crawford went taut every few seconds as he stumbled and caught himself. The lantern swung wildly, casting frantic circles of light that revealed nothing but snow. Halfway back, she lost the road. The snow had shifted the wind, reshaping the drifts into new configurations that bore no resemblance to the landscape she had crossed minutes before. She stopped, lowered Dorothea gently to the ground, and dropped to her knees. She dug again, her fingers numb and clumsy, searching for the packed gravel. Nothing. Loose soil. She moved 2 feet to the left and dug again. Nothing. 2 feet to the right. Her fingers hit something hard, not gravel, stone. She felt along its surface, tracing the grain, and recognized it. Granite. She had found the base of the cliff again. Not the road, but the wall, and the wall would lead her home. She pulled Dorothea up, got Crawford moving, and followed the stone. The cabin door appeared in the lantern light like a hallucination. She slammed her fist against it 3 times. From inside, she heard Silas grunt, heard the scrape of the log brace being lifted. The door swung inward, and heat poured out into the storm, a wave of warmth so intense it made her eyes water. She pushed Dorothea through the opening, then Crawford, then threw herself inside and drove the door shut behind her. For a long moment, no one spoke. Crawford lay on the floor gasping, clutching his wife, staring at the ceiling of the cabin as though he had never seen a roof before. Silas sat by the fire, wrapped in his blanket, his mouth open. Dorothea wept silently, her tears cutting tracks through the ice crystals on her cheeks. Ellie peeled off her frozen outer layers, hung them by the fire, and began heating water. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the pot. The skin on her fingers was waxy and white, and she knew she would lose feeling in several of them for weeks. But everyone was inside. Everyone was alive. Crawford sat up slowly. He looked at the fire. He looked at the neatly stacked wood pile. He looked at the shelves with their meager but carefully organized supplies. Then his eyes moved to the opening at the back of the cabin, the passage into the cave beyond. "What's back there?" he asked, his voice still raw. "Come see," Ellie said. She took the lantern and led him through the passage. Behind them, Dorothea leaned on Silas and followed curiosity overriding exhaustion. The transition from cabin to cave was immediate. The air changed. The sound changed. The world contracted into stone and shadow and the faint, clean smell of damp earth. Crawford stopped walking. He stood in the center of the vaulted chamber, turning slowly, his eyes adjusting to the lantern light, in what he saw dismantled 30 years of certainty about who knew what in this valley and who did not. The sheep stood in their pen, chewing placidly, their wool thick and healthy. The chickens roosted on a low bar, heads tucked, unbothered by the apocalypse raging outside. Along the far wall, raised beds of dark soil held rows of green. Pale, thin, struggling toward a light source that barely existed but green. Living plants in winter underground. The water dripped its steady rhythm into the stone basin. Full. Clean. Crawford turned to Ellie. His face moved through several expressions, each one deeper and more costly than the last. Surprise gave way to comprehension. Comprehension gave way to shame. Shame slowly, painfully gave way to something that looked like awe. "We were wrong," he said. His voice broke on the last word, cracking open, letting something raw and honest escape. "We called you a fool. We watched you leave town with those sheep, and we shook our heads, and we said she'll be dead by Christmas." He stopped, swallowed. My God, we were the fools. Ellie did not savor the moment. There was no triumph in watching a decent man confront his own failure of imagination. She ladled stew into 3 bowls, handed them out, and said the only thing that needed saying. "There's food. Eat." The proof of her wisdom was not in words. It was in the warmth of the bowl Crawford held in his trembling hands. It was in the color returning to Dorothea's face. It was in the steady drip of water and the quiet breathing of animals and the impossible green of carrot tops growing in the dark. The blizzard raged for 3 more days. Inside the cabin and its adjoining cave, a new order established itself, born not from authority but from necessity and the quiet redistribution of respect. Crawford and Dorothea watched Ellie work. They watched her move through her daily routines with the precision of a clockmaker. Every action purposeful, every resource accounted for. They saw that her survival was not luck. It was not stubbornness. It was engineering. On the second day, Ellie came through the passage from the cave and found Crawford and Silas speaking in low voices near the fire. They fell silent when they saw her, but not quickly enough. She had heard enough. "You know what Fosse has been doing?" she said. It was not a question. Crawford could not meet her eyes. His gaze dropped to his hands, which were wrapped around a cup of warm water. "I heard talk," he admitted, "about the timber rights, about the road, rumors about your water too. And you said nothing." The silence that followed was the most honest sound that had been made in that cabin. Crawford sat in it the way a man sits in judgment, knowing the verdict before it is read. His winter order is half my business, Crawford said finally. Without it, the store goes under. Dorothea's health, the medicines she needs, all of it depends on that account. He looked at his wife, who was sleeping fitfully near the fire, her breathing still labored. I wanted to speak up. I told myself I would after winter when things settled down. But there's always a reason to wait. There's always another season to hide behind. Ellie looked at him steadily. I don't blame you, Mr. Crawford. I understand the math. My own father did the same calculation when he put me out. She paused, letting that land. But right now, sitting in my home, eating my food alive, because I walked into that storm for you, you owe me the truth, not silence. Crawford closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted behind them. A decision made a line crossed. He nodded once. Slowly, the nod of a man who knows exactly what it will cost him and has decided to pay. When the storm broke on the morning of the fourth day, the world outside was unrecognizable. The snow lay 4 feet deep across the landscape, smooth and brilliant, under a sky that had been scoured clean to a blue, so deep it hurt to look at. The silence was absolute. No wind, no bird song, nothing. Just the vast white stillness and the blinding glare of the sun on a billion crystals of ice. Crawford, Dorothea, and Silas prepared to leave. They were rested and fed their frostbitten extremities, treated with salves Ellie had improvised from rendered sheep fat and dried herbs. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic farewells, but the way they stood in her doorway blinking in the sun said everything their words could not. Crawford reached into his coat pocket and produced a gold coin. He pressed it into Ellie's palm, and when she started to refuse, he closed her fingers around it. This is not charity, he said, meeting her eyes with a directness he had never shown her before. This is payment for food, shelter, and passage through the worst night of my life. This is a transaction between equals. He held her gaze for a moment longer, making sure she understood that the word equals was not chosen carelessly. Then he said what he had decided to say during those long hours of firelight and silence. When I get back to town, I'm going to tell them what I saw here. All of it. The cabin, the garden, the animals, the water. Everything. He glanced back at the cabin, at the stone walls and the chimney and the cleared ground around it. I know what that means. Fossey will hear. He'll know I've taken your side. He'll pull his order. And I know what that does to my business. He paused. 3 nights ago, I was lying in the snow next to my wife watching her die. You, the person I called a fool, walked into a blizzard to save us. I think I can find the courage to tell the truth in a warm room. He stepped out into the snow. Dorothea followed, leaning on his arm, and behind them, Silas Munn, who had not spoken a word to Ellie since the night he collapsed on her floor. At the edge of the cleared path, Silas stopped. He turned around, and for a long moment, he simply looked at her, his weathered face working through something he did not have the vocabulary to express. Then he touched the brim of his hat, a small, formal gesture of acknowledgement, and walked on. Ellie watched them until they disappeared around the bend of the ridge, 3 small, dark figures moving slowly through an immense white world. Then she went back inside, closed the door, and sat down beside the fire. She was alone again. The cabin was quiet. The cave dripped. She allowed herself 1 minute to feel everything she had held back. The terror of the rescue, the anger at Crawford's confession, the bone-deep exhaustion that she had refused to acknowledge while others depended on her. It rose in her chest and crested and broke, and she pressed her forehead against her knees and breathed through it until it passed. Then she stood up and checked on the animals. The story Crawford brought back to Silver Creek moved through the snowbound town with a speed that defied the frozen roads and shuttered windows. It passed from kitchen to kitchen, from the general store to the livery stable to the church. The tale of the foolish girl in the cave was dead. In its place, something new grew, a story about a woman whose foresight and labor had built the safest homestead in the county, a woman who had walked into a killing blizzard to save 3 people who had mocked her. And the story reached Leland Fossey. The first sign came 2 weeks later as the snow began its slow retreat. Ellie was splitting wood outside the cabin when she heard a horse approaching from the south. Not from the public road, from the open range, a direction that required crossing Foss land. She set the axe head down and waited. Foss came alone. No ranch hands, no entourage, no theater. He rode a tall gray mare and sat in the saddle with the rigid posture of a man who had been arguing with himself for the entire ride, and had not yet reached a conclusion. He dismounted, tied the horse to a scrub oak, and walked toward her. He looked older than she remembered. The winter had taken something from him, too. The lines around his eyes were deeper, the set of his jaw less certain. He stopped 10 feet from her and removed his hat, not out of courtesy, but because he needed something to do with his hands. "I'll be direct," he said. "$200 for the land, 10 times market value. You take the money, go east, start fresh. And if I don't, then I use every legal avenue available. Lawyers, county board, water rights disputes. I have resources you can't match, Miss Whitmore, and you know it." Ellie studied him. The axe was still in her hand, its oak handle smooth and warm from use. She leaned it against the chopping block and crossed her arms. "When I came to Silver Creek last September, you offered me $5 for this land," she said. "You told me it was worthless. Charity, you called it, saving me from a tax burden." She paused. "Now it's 200. That's a remarkable increase in value for a piece of rock that's only good for sheltering rattlesnakes." Foss's jaw tightened. "Don't be clever. Clever doesn't keep you warm when I tie this property up in litigation for the next 5 years. Maybe not, but it tells me something you don't want me to know. Every dollar you add to your offer tells me exactly how much you need what's under this rock. You're not buying worthless land, Mr. Fosse. You're trying to buy the only reliable water source in the valley. And the price keeps going up because you're running out of time." Something shifted in Foss's face. The bluster drained away, and what was left beneath it was something she had not expected. Exhaustion. Not the physical kind, but the exhaustion of a man who has been carrying a weight he cannot set down. 30 years, Fosse said. His voice dropped, losing its commanding edge, becoming rougher, more human. "I built that ranch from nothing. I came to this valley with $40 and a mule, and I turned it into the biggest operation in the county. Every fence post I drove myself. Every barn I raised with my own 2 hands. 3 drought years running. My herd is half what it was. My wells are going dry. The water under this ridge is the only thing between my ranch and ruin." He stopped, and in the silence she heard something she had never expected to hear from Leland Fosse. Honesty. "You think I'm the villain in your story. Maybe I am. But I'm also a man watching everything he built disappear into dust." Ellie stood very still. The wind moved across the open ground between them, carrying the clean, sharp scent of melting snow. She looked at Fosse, and for the first time she did not see a predator. She saw a man her father's age who had spent his entire life building something only to watch the ground shift beneath it. She saw the mirror image of her own fear, the terror of losing what you have sacrificed everything to create. "I'm not your enemy, Mr. Fosse," she said quietly. "And this land is not yours to take. Not for $5, not for $200, not for $5,000. But if you need water and you're willing to come to me as a neighbor instead of a conqueror, then maybe we can talk. But not like this. Not with threats and lawyers and poison in my water supply." Fosse flinched. The word poison landed on him visibly, a blow he absorbed with a slight backward shift of his weight. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I didn't know they'd go that far," he said, and Ellie could not tell if he was lying. It did not matter. What mattered was that he was standing on her land without his men, without his armor, and he was hearing the word no from a person he had underestimated at every turn. He put his hat back on. He looked at the cabin, at the stone walls and the chimney and the cleared ground around it, and whatever calculation he was running behind his eyes produced a result he did not share. He turned and walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode away without another word. His back was slightly bowed, the posture of a man who has just realized that the ground he is standing on has shifted in a way he cannot undo. 2 days after Fosse's visit, Jed Parrish appeared at the cabin. His face told the story before his mouth did. His left eye was swollen shut, a deep purple bruise spreading from cheekbone to brow. His lower lip was split, encrusted with dried blood. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, shoulders squared despite the obvious pain. Fosse found out about the rope, the snare, the hay. He said it simply without self-pity. "I'm done at the ranch. He put me out this morning." Ellie looked at him, at his battered face, his empty hands, his boots worn through at the sole. He had given her tools and supplies when he had nothing to gain and everything to lose. He had kept her secret at the cost of his livelihood, his shelter, his safety. And here he stood, not asking for rescue, but for work. "I know cattle," he said. "I can mend fence, split wood, clear ground. I don't eat much, and I don't complain." She stepped aside and opened the door wider. There's a corner in the cave. Stone floor, no padding, but the temperature holds steady and it's dry. Jed nodded, the ghost of a smile crossing his damaged face. He picked up his small canvas bag, walked through the cabin, and disappeared into the cave. Within an hour, she heard him talking to the sheep in a low, steady murmur, the voice of a man who understood animals and was grateful for their company. As the snow continued its retreat, revealing the brown and muddy bones of the land beneath, the visitors began. They came one at a time, then in pairs, making the long trek up to Hollow Rock with bundles and sacks and offers that were carefully framed as exchanges rather than gifts. A neighbor from the valley brought a sack of seed potatoes and asked for nothing more than a dozen eggs in return. The wife of a cattleman brought 2 jars of preserved peaches and traded them for a small bundle of the winter lettuce Ellie grew in her cave, a delicacy that had achieved something close to legend in the kitchens of Silver Creek. Walt Hardin came with a set of proper iron hinges for the cabin door and a heavy iron latch that would hold against any wind. He asked for a bucket of the rich cave soil for his own garden, nothing more. Crawford came too. He looked thinner. His store was struggling. Fossey had pulled the winter order just as everyone had predicted, and the loss had hit hard. But Crawford carried himself differently now, straighter, his eyes meeting Ellie's without the evasive dart she had grown accustomed to. He brought nails and a small barrel of salt pork, and he told her quietly that he had filed paperwork with the county board confirming her ownership of the Hollow Rock parcel and her rights to all natural resources on and beneath it. Walt Hardin had testified to the public status of the access road. The documents were filed, witnessed, and sealed. Foss can hire all the lawyers he wants, Crawford said, but the record is clean. The land is yours. Then he told her something else, something that surprised him more than it surprised her. Fossey's lost order had hurt, yes, but the new traffic flowing through his store, the eggs, the winter greens, the dried herbs, the cured meats that Ellie and her growing network of trading partners were producing, all of it was beginning to replace what Fossey had taken. Not dollar for dollar, not yet, but the foundation of something more resilient than dependence on a single powerful customer. I lost an account, Crawford said with a wry half-smile that looked unfamiliar on his careful face. But I think I gained a community. Ruth Aiken came last. She did not bring food or tools or supplies. She brought a single sheet of paper folded twice, written in a cramped but legible hand. A statement signed and dated, formally relinquishing any and all claims to the Hollow Rock property. Your grandmother may have made a promise, Ruth said, standing on the porch with her arms across her face as unreadable as ever. But you're the one who earned it. She turned to go. Ellie called after her. Mrs. Aiken, that gap in your west fence. I've got Jed now. He's good with fences. We could patch it up for you if you'd like. Ruth stopped but did not turn around. Leave it, she said after a pause. Never know when someone might need to pass through. It was the closest Ruth Aiken would ever come to saying the word friend, and it was enough. Spring came to the high country the way it always does, not as a gentle awakening, but as a slow, grudging negotiation between the frozen earth and the strengthening sun. One morning the ewe gave birth, a healthy lamb, slick and trembling, finding its legs within the hour, nosing at its mother's side, with the blind determination of all new life. Ellie knelt in the hay beside them, her hands still wet, and felt something unlock inside her chest that she had been holding clenched for months. Outside, the patch of ground she had spent the winter enriching with cave soil was thawing, darkening, softening. She and Jed planted the seed potatoes in rows, working side by side in the thin morning light. The chickens scratched in the yard free, ranging now that the snow had retreated. The cleared land around the cabin was expanding week by week as Jed proved himself worth every scarce mouthful she had gambled on him. One evening in late April, she stood alone on the ledge above the cave entrance and watched the sun set. The light came in low and golden across the valley, painting the granite cliff in shades of amber and rose. The air was soft, carrying the scent of new grass and wet earth, and the faint sweetness of wildflowers beginning to bloom in the sheltered pockets of the ravine. She looked at the cliff face beside her cabin and saw, with the particular clarity that comes from deep exhaustion and deep satisfaction, combined the next chapter. A cold smoker built into a natural fissure in the stone. A root cellar dug deeper into the earth, using the cave's constant temperature to preserve food year-round. A small greenhouse, its back wall, the heat-absorbing rock extending the growing season by weeks on either side. She saw, too, something she had not allowed herself to imagine during the worst of the winter. A second cabin, small sturdy, built against the opposite side of the cliff, its door facing east toward the morning sun. She reached into her collar and drew out the silver chain. She held the pendant in her palm, running her thumb over its tarnished surface, feeling the warmth it had absorbed from her skin. Thomas. 4 months of silence. 4 months of her brother not knowing whether his sister was alive or dead. 4 months of him staring at a ceiling and wondering. That night, by firelight, she sat at the small table Jed had built from salvaged wood and wrote a letter. She wrote it slowly, choosing each word with the care of someone who understands that words once set down become real in a way that thoughts never do. She did not ask Thomas to come. Not yet. She told him she was alive. She told him she had a home built with her own hands, anchored to a cliff of granite in the high country of Montana. She told him about the cave and the water and the garden that grew in the dark. She told him about the lamb born that spring and the chickens and the man named Jed, who had been brave enough to help her when helping could have killed him. She told him about a blizzard and a door she had almost not opened, and 3 people who were alive because she chose to open it anyway. And then she wrote the sentence she had been building toward since the day she left. There is a door here that will never be closed to you. When you are ready, it will be open. She folded the letter, sealed it with a drop of candle wax, and addressed it to Thomas Whitmore, care of the general store, Silver Creek, Montana. Crawford would see that it reached the house on the edge of town. She was certain of that now. She set the letter on the table and looked around the cabin. The fire was low, the embers pulsing with slow, deep heat. Through the passage at the back, she could hear the soft sounds of the cave, the sheep settling for the night, Jed's quiet breathing from his corner. The water, always the water, counting its patient seconds into the stone basin. She thought about doors, the door her father had closed behind her, the sound of the latch no thicker than a pin dropping. The door she had built with her own hands and opened for strangers in a storm. The gap in Ruth's fence left unrepaired on purpose. The door of Crawford's store, where a quiet blacksmith had spoken the truth and walked out without looking back. And now this letter, a door made of paper and ink, sent across the miles to a boy standing behind rippled glass waiting. Every door that closed had led to another one opening. Every loss had become the foundation for something more durable than what was lost. Her father's rejection had given her the land. The land had given her the cave. The cave had given her survival. Survival had given her the chance to save others. And saving others had given her something she had never expected and never asked for. A place in the world. A name that people spoke not with pity, but with respect. A home that was more than shelter. A home that was proof. The work was not over. The work would never be over. There would always be another wall, to build another fence, to mend another season, to prepare for another mouth to feed. The land did not grant rest. It granted only the opportunity to earn another day and another after that in an unbroken chain that stretched forward into a future she could not see but was no longer afraid of. Ellie Whitmore blew out the candle, lay down on the narrow bed she had built against the warm stone wall, and closed her eyes. Outside, the spring wind moved across the face of the cliff, gentle now, carrying the smell of green things growing and the faint sound of water running somewhere deep beneath the earth. Inside, the embers glowed. The animals breathed. The letter waited on the table, ready to travel. And the silver chain lay warm against her throat, connecting her as it always had to the boy who had given away his most precious thing, because he understood at 14 the truth that had taken his sister a winter, a blizzard, and a door to learn. You give not because the other person deserves it. You give because you can.